Hi everyone, so today we're going to be installing some SPC upper control arms as well as some Radflo coilovers. My truck has a 4-inch lift from Procomp. Unfortunately they do not make a coilover that works with their kit, so I had to order some custom coilovers. I'll show you those in a moment, and I'll show you why we're getting rid of the original setup from Procomp. So in the wheel well, as you can see on the top of the strut here, we have a coil spring spacer, which preloads the spring quite a bit, as well as a strut spacer on top of that. Unfortunately, the geometry of the setup, it doesn't quite work. They don't really account for it with their set. What happens is, if you think about when you stack up multiple like cups or glasses in your kitchen, they have a tendency to start to kind of flex and bend. That's the same situation that happens here. So what happens over time is, the top of the strut, the mount that's underneath this coil spacer here, from being on a bit of an angle and torqued, it ends up wearing that out, and then it shifts over and you end up with a bunch of suspension squeaks, and it starts wearing actually into the spacer. Unfortunately, it's not the greatest design, so that's why I'm going with the coilover. But as far as the rest of the angles go with the upper control arm here, the angles are actually quite good with their kit. That's one of the things that Procomp does quite well. They keep their geometry quite good for a bracket lift. BDS has a lot of issues with excessive camber. A lot of their trucks have a real hard time getting into spec with wheel alignments. I've never had that issue with this truck as far as camber goes. They're able to dial it in right into stock specs. But since I'm under here, and it's always a good idea to change them just because of all the extra stress and so on like that, to a heavier duty version, especially if you're going to do any sort of wheeling at all. It'd be a good idea. Anyway, I'll show you the components I'm installing. So here are the coilovers. I went for a non-reservoir shock, a little bit less money, as well as I also happen to live up north, so with all the extra salt and everything like that on the roads, it helps not to have a reservoir at times. And this is due to all the corrosion. I am going to fluid film the crap out of everything after everything's installed, but with less moving parts and accessories on things, it really helps. Onto the upper control arms. I've already inserted the bushings into them. It's quite easy to do. One of the things that's nice about these SPC control arms is you can actually, according to their instructions, torque them in the air instead of torquing them with weight on. That's one of the most common things I would say that amateur mechanics as well as professional mechanics actually skip over when installing control arms, upper control arms, lower control arms, any kind of suspension components. Any sort of bushing that's fixed. A lot of people will forget, install them, and torque them down in the air, and then when they come down on the ground, everything's binding and torquing, and you end up with a lot of other long-term issues and really decreased life on your suspension. But it's kind of cool, you can torque these in the air. If you look at the way these are designed, there's just an insert into the bushing here, and it just spins freely. Nothing's under tension. I've already lubed the crap out of these and installed them, as you can see. One of the other things that I would like to note, my coilovers are adjustable, so I did buy a wrench for them as well. The people I bought them from told me that they should be dialed in pretty well dead on, but I don't want to be stuck having my truck too low or too high, so we'll take some measurements prior to installing for sure. Some other things that you may want to include: can of fluid film, of course, just to spray down everything when you're done, keep it from corroding depending where you live. Some specialty tools that I would suggest you invest in or have for this procedure. Front end service kit. It's all your different ball joint pullers and so forth. You can do this job without these, but this makes it a heck of a lot easier. You will need a large 32mm socket. That's for the new upper ball joint on the SPC control arms. Torque wrench. Grease gun. I don't think the ball joints are pre-lubed, so they do recommend lubing them up. As well as a crowbar, breaker bar. The crowbar is just to help you pry out the old strut and put in the new strut. I'll show you in the video later on because everything's under tension. As well as a spring compressor. The spring compressor probably isn't super necessary. If you had to skip anything in here, you probably don't need that. You can fight with it for a while. But I found when I was installing the coilovers that are on the truck, or the stock ones, since I replaced them, to get it in, it's under a lot of tension, and the extra inch or so, it really helps to compress them down and put them in. So anyway, without further ado, let's get this started. So before jacking up the vehicle or doing anything to it, you want to take some measurements prior. So the first thing you want to do is measure from the center of your hub to the bottom of your fender. So for my passenger side, I've got roughly about 26 inches. You also may want to mark where you're measuring it from on your fender liner. That way you're able to reference the same position. So if you measure over here, it's going to be different. But you want to do this on both sides. Write this down and double check when you install your new components. First step, obviously get the vehicle in the air, supported safely on jack stands or something like that. Next, with the wheel off, you want to undo your brake line bracket. So it'll be a 12mm bolt right here. You want to undo that, as well as compress your pads back a little bit so you're able to pull your caliper off. You'll want to get in here with a little screwdriver and pry them back just a little bit, just to give yourself some space so you're able to take them off and put them back on. I typically just put a screwdriver in between the brake pads and pry. Just make sure that you're not on one of the two boots. These are a dual piston setup, so if you pry close to one of those boots or you mangle it, you will have some issues in the future. Past that, you also want to undo your ABS/speed sensor. Couple clips here. There's a second one further down. Then you also would like to unplug it there with the gray clip right beside the CV. In addition to all that, you also want to take off your brake caliper, and in the back it's a 19mm. There's two bolts, one on top and one on the bottom. With the brakes, ABS sensor, wire, and caliper out of the way, your next step is going to be undoing your upper control arm ball joint as well as your tie rod end. There's going to be a cotter pin you're going to have to bend back, hopefully, if it's still there. Pull that out, take out a nut, as well as with the top there's also a cotter pin as well you're going to have to pull. I would suggest, depending on the condition of your tie rod end, cotter pin, you should replace it. The upper ball joint here, you can retain the same one, but with the SPC control arms you'll have all new hardware. So just wanted to show the ball joint puller in action here. So I had to bend back the heat shield from the brake just a little bit to get the tool in here, but as you can see, this puller will not damage the boot as long as you position it correctly and you're careful with it. Also, the lift kit that I have also relocated the upper tie rod end to the top instead of the bottom, so that's another difference as well. Might be a little bit easier if you have the stock set up where you can take it off from the top. Especially with it reinstalling, it's much easier on the bottom, so you can just put a floor jack underneath to hold the ball joint from spinning. It's a little bit different with it relocated on top, but it is doable. So, just going to show you how this works. 1, 2, 3. And we're out. No damage. Now onto the upper control arm ball joint. I position my floor jack underneath the lower control arm just in case it pops down, which it will a little bit, but it's just for a bit of safety just in case. So let's get it undone. The upper ball joint is now disconnected. Now I'm going to take off the upper control arm. You will have to remove this inner splash shield here. There's a plastic clip here with a couple tangs on the inside. You'll have to squeeze them together and slide it out. If you just pry, they will break. This way you have enough space to get into the upper bolt here. You got side here and a side and the nut in the back. This was torqued down to, I believe, 173 foot-pounds, so it's going to take quite a bit of muscle to get it off, but with limited space it will be easier with two people. How to go a little further with the splash shield removal. So as you can see over here, I undid the one clip, Over here I also undid 2 clips for this splash shield here. It's under a tremendous amount of torque. It's a 22mm bolt, so luckily it's spaced out just right with my long socket as well as my cheater bar. And it would be super helpful to have a helper here just in case this side starts to spin, but I work on my own, so I'm sure as most of you can relate. We'll see how it goes. The bolt came out actually not too bad. I was able to spin the nut off on this end just long enough that it held on, so I didn't have to get a wrench on the other end with the big breaker bar, and I just spun it off by hand the rest of the way. Where the difficulty really comes in is up top. So in the engine bay here you have numerous hoses that'll be in your, you have a couple hoses that'll be in your way, and there's a plastic clip right down here that I have undone. There it goes, there it focuses. So you have to unclip that. There'll be one, I believe it's a coolant hose. Correct me if I'm wrong. And there will also be part of the electrical loom there. So you have to move these both out of the way and manipulate both of these around the bolt and wiggle it out. So working on the driver's side, getting the upper control arm out is a bit more difficult. And this is due to having all these hard lines in the way. So it's very challenging to access this nut. So this is where you're going to need a second person for sure. One person to hang onto the wrench here, and then someone's going to have to go up top from the top side and break it loose from the other end. There is a bracket for this large loom here. It's attached up here to the side of the fender. Well, it's a 10mm. Loosen it off and push it out of the way, and you'll have access with an extension and a 22mm socket. Prior to installing your upper control arms, you want to go through your instructions and read them very carefully. So I'm installing on the right side, and of course here, right side is the correct side. I've already lubed up and put my pins into the bushings. The other thing too, when you read your instructions, depending on how much of a lift you have or what your alignment professional recommends, they have different caster settings. So for me, my alignment professional recommended D. So if you go to your ball joint, and look here, you have a square washer on top, and depending on the position of that square washer, you set up your caster. So for me, I'm going for D. As you can see, it's longwise along with the ball joint. In the illustration, it's not quite the same in real life as the illustration, but you get the point. So once this is at here, you want to install your ball joint into your upper control arm. They tell you to put it right in the middle for initial alignment settings. In addition, the sort of cupped washers that you've taken off, you will no longer be needing these. You will use the supplied washers in the kit, here and here, and if you forget how they came off your truck in the illustration, it'll show you they go on the outsides. So you put them on either end with your bolt through and the nut on the end. So let's get this in the truck. I will install the upper control arm later in this video. It's just this way I have more space and I don't have it dangling down in front of where I'm trying to work. So now I'm going to take out my strut assembly. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to undo these 4 nuts up top. In addition, once I'm finished that, undo the bolt on the bottom here, slide this out, and then I'll pry out the whole assembly. Strut is all disconnected from the top and bottom. Now here's where your pry bar comes in handy, and if you have a second person, it's a lot of help. So now what you're going to want to do, you're going to want to put your pry bar in between your lower control arm and your strut, and you're going to want to pry upwards, as well as if you have an extra person, you can have one person holding the bar and pushing down on the lower control arm, and the second person can grab out the strut. Just had the old coil out and comparing them side by side. Look fairly close in length, but the main difference here is up top. So you see that natural lean that the upper strut mount has here on the Radflo? The Pro Comp system does not account for this. A lot of other kits out there The top spacer will actually be on a bit of a bevel, which helps with alignment, and there's a left and a right. I can't remember if there's left and a right with the ProComp kit, but I believe they're interchangeable from side to side. They just have to be keyed in a certain way. But as you can see, the geometry will be a lot better. So for the install of the coilover, I've also utilized my spring compressor as well. I'm still on my own. Just compress it down just a little bit just to get it up and over the lip here. I also disconnected the sway bar end link here as well, which I didn't show earlier. The sway bar end link you will have to tighten up when it's on the ground under full load. That's one of those tension rubber bushings where if you tighten it up in the air and you put it down the ground, it'll be all bound up. So anyway, one other thing to note. So the front of the shocks have a little bolt in the front, and if you have a reservoir shock, which I guess this could be a reservoir shock, your reservoir will be coming out the front. So to note how these are installed, because they don't really have an arrow or left or right, you should have this facing forward. Now with the spring compressor out of the way, I have my upper control arm installed. You have to fish the long bolt back and through the same way it came out. You have to weave around all your hoses and wiring loom there. Also, don't forget to reconnect to that little bracket that's up here in the corner. Make sure to put your, I believe it's coolant hose, as well as your part of your electrical loom there. Clip that back in, don't forget. And then torque this bolt down to 173 foot-pounds. Upper control arm all torqued up. Now we just have to attach the lower ball joint here, as well as the tie rod end. Much easier to tighten up the upper ball joint here on your UCA when when your tie rod end is in. The tie rod torque spec is 51. Upper control arm here is 45 according to SPC, and the nut on the very top is they want torque to 150. Alright, so now we have the tie rod torqued, upper control arm ball joint torqued, cotter pins are in. I took the load off by putting the floor jack underneath on the lower control arm, boosted up a little bit to take out the slack on the coilover so I could tighten up the 4 bolts on top to 33 foot-pounds. Past that, now it's time to put your brakes on. So slide your rotor on and then go to your caliper. Caliper bolts are 79 foot-pounds. Also ensure that this brake line here is not all tangled and bound up. You want that nice and straight, just like you took it off. And past that, get your wheel back on and then finish off the rest of your torques for your sway bar end link. If you did disconnect it, that'll be 79 foot-pounds. That's off the lower control arm. And also you want to torque your lower strut mount on the lower control arm here, and that'll be 144 foot-pounds. So with everything installed and everything torqued down, with the vehicle back on the ground and driven back and forth a couple times, settle out the suspension, maybe even take it around the block, you want to perform your same initial measurement that you did at the beginning of this procedure. So you want to take a measurement from the middle of your hub to the bottom of the fender liner in the same spot. For me, that'll be the tip of the star on my little hubcap there. So on my passenger side, I measured 25 inches and my initial measurement was 26. On the driver's side, I'm about 24 and a half and my initial measurement was 25 and 15/16. I'm just going to round it up to 26. The driver's side of these vehicles is definitely a bit heavier, especially if you have a full tank of fuel. A couple other things to note. Before you start adjusting your adjustable shocks, no matter what brand they are, you want to go into your instructions and see what the max preload setting you can have for your coilovers is. Unfortunately, mine did not come with any instructions, so I had to call Radflo and check with them to see what the max preload I could set mine at was. So from the very top of the strut here, where you see the threads start, to the top of the adjuster nut, I can have a max of 2 inches between there. The initial measurement was 1 inch. So according to them, every 5 turns of this adjuster clockwise will equate to about 1 inch in overall lift. So I'm going to see how that goes. When adjusting these, you want to have your vehicle in the air and the suspension at full droop, and make sure to support the vehicle as well. just finished up with the alignment last night. I actually ended up doing the alignment myself at a buddy's shop. He has an alignment rack, so I'll just show a quick picture now. So the alignment itself took me a couple hours. Never done it on my own, so it was an interesting experience, but got it all dialed in. As you can see from the side shot here, everything looks nice and right. One thing I would like to note, while I was installing the coilovers, I didn't have an issue on the passenger side, but on the driver's side, if you can see that lower eyelet there for the bottom of the coilover, the driver's side, for whatever reason, the inner bushing on the eyelet was actually machined under tolerance, and it was machined to 5/8 inner diameter, and it should have been machined to 60 millimeters. So prior to installing your coilovers, while you have them in the box and out of the truck, I would strongly recommend checking this out prior to installation so you don't waste any time. Luckily I have a metal lathe handy and I was able to ream it out, but I also informed Radflo of this situation and they're actually sending me some new bushings, as they should. I'm going to keep them as spares. But yeah, definitely something to note. Another thing as well, when I was doing my installation here and I was adjusting my camber and caster and so on, I had to adjust the upper control arm to the G position, and this actually moved the tire forward, and it gave me additional clearance in the rear of the tires, so now I don't rub anymore from going lock to lock on my mud flaps, which I did slightly before. This truck does not have a body mount chop. Some other takeaways as well. Truck rides a hell of a lot nicer than it did before. It's still quite jiggly, but I mean that's typical of a truck. Just going to give you a full side shot here of the vehicle. Nice and leveled. Anyway, that's going to conclude this video. Thanks for watching.